All right. Good evening, everybody, and I'm so thrilled to see this full room and to have a conversation about criminalized identities. That's the paper we're going to present with my colleague, called Brisbane. And we have about 20 minutes, right? Somebody keeping the time. Hopefully we'll be okay with that. Trevor Noah wrote a book called, I'm sure everyone knows who he is, Born a Criminal, because he was born of a black mother and a white father in South Africa at the time when marriage was illegal between the two. And I was thinking when I read his book that something more ridiculous than being born a criminal, a crime, is to be born a criminal. And I am one of the people who was born a criminal. That's the gift I got at my birth. And I want to start this presentation, which will have both a theoretical framework and a more personal side of it, and a theory I have on the plight of the Roma people, with a personal story that happened in 2006. When I was in the United States the first time, during that time I was a college student in Bucharest. I'm originally from Romania. And I was here with a summer program. At the time I was completely closeted about my Roma identity. Absolutely no one knew about it. And it was an incredible summer where a lot of people thought I'm from so many countries and cultures. It was a journey of self-discovery, and where people projected all sorts of identities on who I was, and something that I always identified and seen as negative, my rather dark skin for Romanian society. It became, I don't know if it's the right word to use, but an acid, like a way to connect with people. So that allowed me to become more open and happy, and just to kind of appreciate who I am a little more, but I was still closeted about my Roma identity. A week before I returned to Romania, I was there for another 3 years before I came back to US with a Fulbright scholarship in 2009 at Vanderbilt University. I was in the middle of an incident. I was home with a friend of mine, and he happens to be the cousin of singer Roberta Flack, if that tells you anything. And he played, as him and many other people I met in US at the time, an important role in my growth, just understanding the American culture. And he misplaced $700. He could not find it. And although he never accused me of anything, I immediately started crying and acting like I am the one guilty of it, although I knew I am not. And I acted so bizarre and so out of proportions that I remember asking him to look in my bag, and he was so shocked and surprised why I'm acting like this, because he was just worried he could not find $700. I could not stop crying. He went back to his office, home office. He found the money. He came to tell me, and I started crying even more. Before I continue with that story, I should tell you a little bit about my background and how I grew up. I grew up in Romania in a highly assimilated Roma family, with a grandfather being a blacksmith, and a grandmother being a social worker, and a parents that their greatest mission in life was to keep me away from gypsy stereotypes. And what that meant was, I think I heard every other day how we should not be like the way gypsies are seen, how important it is to never steal, never be tempted by anything people have. My grandmother was always about being transparent and not being involved in any kind of corruption. Sometimes I joke with my friend and I say, if you want to raise your children with really great values, you should send them to a Roma family that want to belong to society. But they will work 2 times harder to, or 2 times, hundreds of times harder to raise you these values, because you need some kind of capital. You need to be believed. You need to be really, really, just like have nothing that someone can accuse you of. My father used to say to never be tempted by any people's goods so often, probably more than a priest in a church. So I grew up with this, and in my immediate family, there were no criminal records. There were no nothing that would make them have this other than the overall stigma and deep stereotypes about gypsy behavior. So I try my best to hide my Roma identity, which really meant to stay away from all this negative association. And when this incident happened, because I got more open and I wanted so much to be worthy and to be believed and to be trustworthy and to be really seen as human. I know that sounds weird, but for the first part of my life, I spent time proving that I am human. So my friend found the money, but at this time I was already crying for quite some time. And I had to explain my behavior somehow. And that was part of it. But another part was I truly received so much when I was in the States for the first time. You know, the stranger's kindness and people being open. And I felt like it's time to be open and truthful about who I am as I had never been before. And that's when I talk about the first time about being Roma. So and I said to him that, and that was truly the beginning of my journey of starting to learn about my Roma identity. What it's interesting for me now looking back was, even if I had not committed any crime, even if he not even accused me, how powerful my response was, how incredibly powerful that moment, that explosive moment of trying to prove so hard that I'm not a criminal was. And that was really, the beginning of, it's been 12 years since then, the work I do right now. And my colleague, Cal, will continue. I will come back with more on my work. Basically some explanations and theoretical framework of how can this be possible? How can a behavior like this be possible?
All right, so thank you so much, Cristiana, for sharing that story, and thank you so much to Meira Goldberg and Antoni Pizà and all the other organizers for hosting us today and letting us present. My name is Cal Brisbane, and I've been collaborating with Cristiana for about 1.5 years, ever since she first told me about her idea for the Roma Peoples Project. And I also work as a research assistant at Yale University's ESTEAM Lab, which is located about 15 blocks away. And there we conduct studies aimed at improving the mental health of sexual and gender minorities. And before Cristiana presents on the implications of her story, I'd like to briefly frame it in terms of some psychological theory I've learned at the lab. And there, our focus includes interventions aimed at mitigating the effects of what researchers term minority stress. So minority stress refers to the unique and persistent stressors faced by members of minority groups in societies where those groups are stigmatized. And this is compounded by general life stress. It's been repeatedly identified as a causal factor in the health and mental health disparities observed among racial and sexual minorities compared to majority populations. Minority stress includes distal stressors, which are sources of stress external to the stigmatized individual, such as those operating at the structural level, like discriminatory laws, negative stereotypes and prejudicial cultural norms, as well as those operating at the interpersonal level, such as discriminatory treatment and hate crimes. Beyond distal stressors, though, minority stress also includes what are called proximal stressors, internal, individual-level sources of stress that result from exposure to distal stressors. Proximal stressors are the psychological processes that occur when distal stressors, like discrimination, get under the skin, so to speak, and interfere with emotional and cognitive functioning. They constitute a part of what sociologist Karen Pike calls the hidden injuries of racism and other subjugating forces. These proximal stressors can take numerous forms and often serve to elevate universal risk factors that make individuals vulnerable to emotional dysfunction, like hopelessness and rumination. However, they also create specific consequences for different sources of stigmatization. At the Esteem Lab, one proximal stressor that we aim to reduce in research participants is internalized homonegativity, which refers to the internalization of negative societal attitudes towards homosexuality, and which has been associated with depression, anxiety, and HIV risk behavior among sexual minorities. Another proximal stressor is group-based rejection sensitivity. Rejection sensitivity refers to chronic vigilance towards rejection or attack and is evidenced at the group level among stigmatized minorities. In such cases, individuals with the stigmatized identity anxiously expect, readily perceive, and intensely react to potential rejection for fear of, in contexts where such rejection is possible or salient. For example, the social psychologists Geraldine Downey and Rodolfo Mendoza-Denton have identified this phenomenon among Black students at American colleges, which historically excluded students of color and which still harbor racial marginalization. When controlling for other factors, students that demonstrated more race-based rejection sensitivity reported lower self-esteem and levels of school connectedness. Among sexual minorities, sexual orientation-based rejection sensitivity has been implicated in the elevated rates of depression, social anxiety, generalized anxiety, and post-traumatic stress symptoms observed among this population. In a world that denigrates, discriminates, incarcerates, and otherwise punishes minorities for their minority status, vigilance towards potential rejection or attack can be essential for survival. But proximal stressors like group-based rejection sensitivity take a toll even when threats are largely absent. Although research on proximal stressors among racial and sexual minorities has advanced in recent years, there exists a dearth of research by and about Roma populations and the ways in which anti-Roma sentiments and structures affect health and mental health. Given the many distal stressors faced by Roma communities, though, many Roma individuals may struggle under the weight of Romani-specific minority stress, and the evidence available indicates that Roma tend to suffer disproportionately elevated rates of mental health and health issues. Law professor and Max Weber fellow Gregor Mauchek has written that Roma are among the most deprived of all communities, facing daily discrimination, harassment, and racial insults, and living in extreme poverty and exclusion from mainstream society. Part of this plight involves negative stereotypes about Roma, which are deeply rooted in mainstream societies where they live, and despite some positive stereotypes, such as those making essentialist associations between Roma and music/dance, the stereotypes are overwhelmingly negative. Of these negative stereotypes, one of the most salient and impactful is the notion that Roma have a propensity towards criminal behavior, which we believe has the potential to amplify stressors of Roma struggles. This may have been the case in Cristiana's story, and now I'll turn back to her to elaborate on this particularly insidious anti-Roma stereotype and some of its potential ramifications.
Thank you. All right, so it was good after a decade to understand what led me to act the way I did some years ago, that there is an explanation for that. Just continuing on my colleague Cal, starting to share a little bit about how Roma people are seen, we came across this quote from Cervantes, which was one of my favorite authors as a child and teenager, and I just cannot stop thinking about it, and it's on the screen, but I want to just read because I think it's so powerful. the last part of it, in them, the love of thieving and the ability to exercise are qualities inseparable from their existence and never lost until the hour of their death. This is Cervantes, one of the most appreciated and celebrated author. All right, and not much has changed until today. So what's the difference between criminal behavior and criminalized identity? A criminal behavior, it's linked to a crime that is committed or suspected of being committed or being convicted of it. But the criminalized identity is separated from it. It could be because of a crime you have committed, but it can be completely independent from it. So whether a person have committed or not a crime, or being suspected or not of it, it's still, that person still suffers from criminalized identities. And here I like to make a comparison that is not the most conventional one, but I actually truly believe in it, that there are many similarities, strikingly so, between Roma people and royals. So what's the similarity between Roma and royals? The following. No matter what the behavior of an individual is, people already know who you are. They have a script about you. They have a very clear image about how your life will develop, with or without taking into consideration your behavior. The biggest difference, of course, is it's called it's an ascribed identity. It's an identity you receive by definition. It is linked with your humanity. The difference, of course, is that in the case of royals, it's positive by definition most of the times and beautiful in whatever way you frame it, because framing it is about power. It's not only about facts. Whereas in the case of the Roma, sort of the bottom of the social hierarchy, it's by definition negative. So what does that actually mean for Roma people is that we are born in a prison, in a psychological prison, in a prison that is created by centuries of beliefs and stereotypes that we have internalized. So my theory is the following, that after so many hundreds of years of discrimination, persecution, and ways in which we have been seen, these images have been internalized by Roma people, not only on the individual level, but collectively. And because of that, a criminalized identity of the Roma is at the core of the Roma plight, that no matter, we are very different. Roma people are very different from different regions, different countries, very different. But what we have in common is a kind of relationship with criminality, like denying it. Most of the time is in Roma studies or Roma activism is we are not this. We don't want to be seen as such. But when you define yourself in that way, when you deny that, you still have a connection with it. It's still at the core of who you are. And my theory on this is the criminalized identities lead many Roma, as in my case, to being closeted. It leads to stigma. It leads to being closeted, and therefore the Roma people collectively has to suffer because of that. And the most probably sad and upsetting part is that with or without reinforcement from society, we carry that oppression with us. We have it inside of us. And that's why in my case, although I wasn't in a case of being accused or even being anywhere close to criminal behavior of any kind, I had that very strong reaction. And that's the reason why many, many Roma stay away from being Roma. And I think that beyond fighting anti-Gypsyism and stereotypes and structural racism, which is the case in many societies, or ignorance, very few people know, or not many at least, that there are Roma in the United States as we speak right now for hundreds, many generations. Some are refugees or just arriving. I get messages from lawyers and to help them with their hearings, to give some kind of expertise on their case. And so beyond that, beyond what needs to be done by society and others, we need to understand what this internalized stigma and criminalized identity did to us and find a way to disrupt that and reclaim, or maybe claim for the first time, who we are. And here we get to solutions, right? You want to help with that? We can talk together about this. Okay, so, all right, so what the Roma People's Project is doing, project I founded at Columbia University last year, is to disseminate counter-stereotypical narratives. So instead of saying Roma are not like this or like this or like that, we spotlight Roma role models and friends of Roma that are have nothing to do with the criminalized identities or any other stereotypes, to generate an alternative to how Roma people are. And so there are some really remarkable Roma role models there. We discover more and more, and it's one of the best parts of our work. And on the same line, really to the way we can fight these internalized criminalized identities is by truly get to know Roma people, to truly try to understand what is beneath all of these stereotypes, and create identities that are positive and empowering.
And then because I'm coming from this psych lab, I'll just say also that psychotherapy tailored by and for Roma may be effective in mitigating the effects of some of the distal and proximal stressors faced by Romani populations. For instance, cognitive behavioral therapy geared towards sexual minorities seems to aid those minorities in reducing internalized homonegativity and navigating a prejudicial world. Also, brief psychological interventions, like ones involving affirmation of personal values, have been shown to insulate stigmatized individuals from environmental threats to their identity. Most importantly, though, and as Cristiana touched on, the most powerful solutions to criminalization, distal stressors, and proximal stressors will come from dismantling and transforming the social structures that stigmatize certain groups in the first place. And to quote Dr. Bachankis of the Esteem Lab, referencing Pierre Bourdieu, "Lest social structures be seen as ironclad forces impervious to change, it should be noted that social structures are ultimately composed of individuals, with individuals holding the power to change those structures."
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And my apologies, I didn't introduce you, but I actually didn't have the information, but excellent presentation. Maybe we should save the questions for at the end of the whole panel. So we can get started with the next presenter, which is not a duo, but a trio. And of course, we know Meira Goldberg, who is a resident scholar here at the Foundation for Iberian Music of the Graduate Center. And she recently published Sonidos Negros, which is going to be, I still have not read the full volume, but it's going to be a really, really great contribution to some of the issues that we're trying to study today here. On the other hand, we have Thomas Baird. Tom is the co-director of the Apollo's Banquet, a New York City-based Baroque dance and music ensemble. And also Ana de la Paz. She's a dancer specializing in many styles of Spanish dance, including the courtly 18th century Escuela Bolera, the folkloric dances such as the Jota and the Muñeira, the elegant classical Spanish dances, and the powerful and deep interpretations of flamenco. So welcome the three of them. Thank you.
Come out. Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. I think I want to say a couple of things to Cristiana, and thank you so much for your presentation. And one of the things that I think we're talking about, and Brenda and I have talked about this so much, of course, is the idea of talking about the people as opposed to talking about the image, and realizing that they do exist in a dialogical relationship with each other. So what we're going to be talking about today is about the image, and it's very interesting because we're going to be talking about the Jácara, which is about criminals. And it turns out in Spanish flamenco that these criminals are kind of really central to, not only flamenco identity, but I would argue to Spanish identity. So, yeah. How do I make this move? In early modern Spain, the ruffian jaque, figured in the dance song and literary form called Jácara, emerged as an astute and potentially subversive anti-hero, whose noisy equivocations and stoic suffering added depth, dramatic attention, and sardonic wit to the great works of the Siglo de Oro. The sharp-tongued meta-theatrical commentary of these stage characters ruptured the dogma of Dios, Patria y Rey, God, country, and king, precisely by calling into question the moral precepts of the rule of crown and church. Francisco de Quevedo's circa 1610 Carta del Escarramán a la Méndez is an acid satire, yet also an elegy to a ruffian anti-hero, Escarramán. It spurred countless imitations in the early 17th century. On-stage jácaras fell into the realm of theatrical bailes. Among Spanish dance historians, it is widely observed that baile and danza both refer to dance, with baile staking out the more popular and noisier end of the spectrum, and danza tending toward the gentility of aristocratic dances. But in her important doctoral dissertation on the discourse of the ruffian in Quevedo's Jácaras of 1991, Bronwyn Hewer points out a curious polysemy in the word baile. Its primary meaning is dance, music, and a verse form, but its secondary meaning is thief.